double homicides of Maggie and Paul really changed everything.
I think this may very well be related to the death of Mallory Beach. What was the motivation other than revenge?
There are facts that don't add up and bodies tied to this family.
Did their dynasty unravel, or will they continue having power and people and law enforcement being fearful of them? I think it's going to be really interesting just to watch the investigation of Stephen Smith and where it leads.
Hey everybody, thank you for joining us for another episode of What's to Watch. I'm Savannah Jones.
And I'm Rex Ravita. Today we have Dr. John and Lauren Matthias from Hidden True Crimes to discuss the very crazy story behind the popular Netflix documentary Murdaugh Murders.
All right, so I'm from Savannah, and I don't know if y'all know, like that area in South Carolina is super close to where they were at. So I remember a lot of this in like real time. So that tip of the iceberg was the 2019 boat crash that, left one person dead. That was like the first public stain on the Murdaugh legacy. So how did this situation lead to the domino effect that ultimately led to, Alex Murdaugh killing his wife and child?
Dr. John?
I think I would see the boat crash as the beginning of a series of events that uncovered a number of family secrets that, once they were exposed, probably led to the murders. So I think the boat crash really kind of throws the door open into, and giving us a glimpse that this family probably doesn't want us to have, but it gives us a greater glimpse behind the dynasty and their secrets. And I think, like most families, secrets catch up with families, and if they're bad enough, I guess they can lead to murder. I hope they don't usually, but in this case, it seems like the secrets were pretty dark and pretty deep, and that's where they led us.
So if the crash was the catalyst, as you kind of said, do you think, had that not happened, like what do you think would be different today?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I would have to believe that this family would continue doing what they've done, which is to maintain as much power and prestige and privilege as they can. And I doubt we would have gotten here. I definitely think the murders never would have occurred. I doubt we would know. Eventually, the financial crimes probably would have been uncovered because Gloria Satterfield's children were still bilked out of millions of dollars. So I think eventually this would have been uncovered, but there would have been a lot less harm to everybody.
If Alex's financial crimes were discovered at a later date, by that time, Paul might have left the home, and he wouldn't necessarily be to blame for anything being uncovered or being indicted, which would create family shame. So the ending might have looked a lot different.
That's what I was about to ask. You guys mentioned on the podcast, they're a shame-bound family system. I like the comparisons you made to Pat Conroy and how just covering up stories in the South and the parallels there. So could you talk a little bit about what you mean by a shame-bound family system?
Yeah, so a shame-bound family system would be a family that probably has a lot of secrets and maybe some trauma in their past, which creates shame. And then the system tries to essentially cover up that shame or to deny that shame. And so the family becomes bound to that shame and to those traumas, and that shame gets passed down through the generations, knowingly or unknowingly, mainly unknowingly, unless the family's willing to address it or face it head on, which, if you guys know the South, it seems like that's something that the Murdaugh family never wanted to do. So
I think Savannah knows the South.
Yeah, I don't want to make blanket generalizations about the South either. So
we're both
from
Mississippi
too.
Yes.
So
okay.
I know.
Okay.
And we're
All
in
right,
Texas, so
Well,
okay.
you two can be the expert on the South then. You tell us.
Right.
Oh, definitely. That's a thing, especially, with rich families and everything like that.
Yeah.
There's so many people in the local authorities, and just, it's very corrupt in some ways.
And I would add, I just know in that area, like Georgia, South Carolina, it's just such a clear class difference that it's just crazy. Like, some people are living in poverty, homeless, and that gets passed down from generation to generation. But then you also know very affluent people that like have been rich for hundreds and hundreds of years that just like kind of just, so it's like not really a middle class. It's like you're either poor or you're like really, really rich. So that definitely, I feel like, plays a big part in everything. So with that being said, what is the potential impact of growing up in a family with such a rich history of power, wealth, and influence on an individual's mental health and their overall behavior?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm going to stay away from generalizations here. There are some rich families that have better mental health than other families. I think it has to do with how the family deals with emotions and how they deal with the world around them, whether they deal with the world around them in an accurate fashion, whether they're able to process information accurately, or whether they deny that. So most family, the key ingredient to most healthy families is healthy communication. And the Murdaugh family, we talked about this a little bit on our podcast, just the idea that Buster could take the stand and say that everyone in the family believed that Paul was not driving the boat is incredible, right? That like the evidence is overwhelming that he was driving the boat. In addition to all the witnesses that saw him driving the boat, you had Mark Tinsley, who's the attorney for Mallory Beach, hired biomechanical engineers to say, this is exactly how these injuries occurred based on the speed and timing of the boat crash. And they proved conclusively that Paul was driving the boat. And yet this family is universal. They're all on the same page. They're unitarily willing to say that Paul wasn't driving the boat, so they're not culpable at all, right? It's mind-boggling.
Do you think it's just because they couldn't imagine admitting something shameful in their family, or do you think they really just had each other's backs, or what's the story behind that?
I'm going to let Dr. John answer that, but I also think it shows the amount of denial. I don't even know if it's admitting as much as just how their minds and their system works to deny any narrative that is not going to fit what their family system needs.
Yeah, and some of it definitely, like you said, Rex, some of it definitely has to do with shame, in the sense that I think this is a family that sees themselves as perfect. They're perfect. They're infallible, right? And so to admit or acknowledge that one of their family members may have involuntarily killed someone, I think that just doesn't fit with their perception of themselves, or what I would call their family myth.
So when you said denial, Lauren, do you think there was any true denial? Like they didn't even believe it themselves, or were they just putting on to protect their son?
I'm going to let John answer that. I think there might have been a combination. I think some of them might have known that they were telling a falsehood. I think others, denial can be so strong that it's almost believe they convince themselves of it. But I'll let the psychologist speak more to that.
Yeah, it's really hard to know. I think in families like this, sometimes there's kind of a collective delusion about reality, and that's what makes them so different. And that's why they have such a sense of entitlement, because in some ways, families like this, with their power, they're able to shape reality. For most of us, reality shapes us. You know, when I get my mortgage payment, if I don't pay it, they're going to take away our house, right? So, but maybe for a rich family, they can, apparently Alec can call the bank and say, hey, I'm not paying this mortgage because I'm rich and, powerful. And the bank apparently goes along with that, right? So I think this is a family that definitely had enough power to kind of shape the reality of that county. And most of us, not that I'd want to be in that position, but most of us don't have that power or ability to really influence the world at that level.
I think you can also call it not just power, but privilege. I think that when you are privileged, you do naturally, subconsciously, without knowing, get away with things that other people can't get away with. And thus, It's not just denial, but simply this is the way the world works. Normal is what one is accustomed to. So why would they not be able to do this again in this situation?
So can you speak to the psychological effects of addiction and substance abuse? I was just like listening to like some news from the area and stuff, and like 60 pills a day, like that's a lot. How might that relate to, his behavior and just how that affects everything?
I think I was a little circumspect about that information because I think that was mainly information the defense wanted to really try to get across to the jury to kind of create some sympathy for him. That's not to say that I don't think he's a drug addict or had a drug problem, but I think that the defense's argument, or one of their arguments, was that he made really bad decisions because he was taking so many drugs. And I think they wanted to see that, in part as a way to excuse his behavior. I mean, they never said obviously that he killed them, but I think they were trying to say, yeah, he made some bad decisions around the financial crimes, but how can you blame him because he was taking so many opiates? Like, obviously we would do that too, right? If we were taking so many opiates, we would clearly, rob and steal from people. And so, but I think it was, to answer your question, Savannah, addiction is insidious, and it has a really negative impact on people. And obviously people will go to great lengths to do anything to get drugs if necessary. And maybe that's part of the story, but drugs are never the cause for murder. They might be a catalyst, but they're not the cause. And, I've done a lot of therapy groups over the years with criminals, sex offenders, violent criminals, murderers. And a lot of them try to make that argument. They come into my groups and they say, well, the drugs made me do it. And they don't. They didn't. They don't. They will never make you do it. It has to do with violent impulses or violent ideation that's already there. And so the drugs they're part of this story, but they didn't make him do anything. And I really think that was part of the defense strategy to humanize him a little bit and to get some sympathy from the jury.
I think also the question with the addiction, because yes, I believe that he had an addiction. Whether or not he was taking 60 pills a day is debatable. It seems like a lot, but the question is, what comes first? Is it the shame-based system and the denial of all of his emotions that cause the addiction, or the addiction that caused this? And I think that what Dr. John and I both believe is that this intergenerational shame and the family system and the enmesh system and the avoidance of all emotions is what caused the addiction.
My take on addiction, generally speaking, is that it's a type of self-medication. There are people that would disagree with me and say that it's more of a medical issue, and I don't dispute that, but I think that at least initially it can become a medical issue over time, but I think that at least initially a lot of it has to do with self-medicating, and specifically self-medicating emotions like shame, getting away from those emotions, those negative emotions that in the Murdaugh family, they were never taught to process or to feel or to deal with. And at some point, those usually catch up with us. So,
and even covering up perhaps those violent ideations, the thoughts.
Right. Opiates are a good way. If you're having a lot of violent thoughts, opiates are a good way to blunt or suppress some of those thoughts. So that could be part of it too.
So you think that was maybe passed down to Paul, and that's why he was such a big drinker, or was he just partying because of his age?
I definitely think some of his alcoholism and his partying has to do with the fact that he simply had no capacity to deal with his emotions or to deal with anything realistically. Paul, according to a lot of sources and stories, Paul would run around saying, I can do anything because I'm a Murdaugh. So if that's your perception of the world, why deal with anything? Why deal with reality or emotions or your thoughts? Why not just go party and push the limits, because that's what you expect?
So do you think that Alex was maybe a sociopath, or just like always this violent? Like, who would kill their, wife and son like that?
Like that, in that fashion, like...
I'll let John answer in just a second, but I know that he can't diagnose or tell you what he thinks as far as, an exact diagnosis, but I can.
Reworded.
So I can speculate with you. So I'll take even though this
is not my opinion. But.
Yeah. So even he's the psychologist, I'll speculate with you. I personally, as just a person looking in on this case, do think there's likely a personality disorder, whether that's NPD, narcissistic personality disorder, psychopathy, or a sociopath. I definitely think there was something there, because one of the main catalysts, and this is where John can maybe just tell you in general terms what that means, but sometimes it's the avoidance of shame that helps create that personality disorder. So these two things often do go hand in hand. But if you want to talk to John in general questions about it, but can't because he's licensed.
Maybe I meant sociopathic tendencies, not a sociopath.
Right. Yeah, that's a better way to talk about this. I can talk about, does he have some psychopathic features? So just usually in the academic world, the academics prefer to use the term psychopath and not sociopath. They're often synonymous, but like all the research talks about like psychopaths. So I'll use the term psychopath. I think he definitely tends to have some psychopathic features for sure. There's a lack of empathy. There's a lack of remorse. There's a lot of manipulativeness. There's this callousness that seems to be present, that, which ironically, that's not the facade he presents. But if you look deeply at his behaviors and how he treats people and the way he parties and takes money, and, I talked about the one of the cases that just absolutely floored me as a human being was Hakeem Pinkney. And, I thought he took $1 million from Hakeem, but Hakeem was well, first of all, he was deaf. He had a disability to begin with. And then he gets in this car wreck and he becomes quadriplegic. He needs this money to survive. He needs this money just for basic health care. And Alec Murdaugh takes $2 million from the family. It's astonishing. So, I mean, essentially, he's saying, I don't care if this 23-year-old dies. I'd rather have the money to hire private jet. That's what he did with the money, by the way. He was chartering private jets and flying to the Super Bowl. And he had, in some of the stadiums, they have the special penthouse areas where you can park. That's what he was doing. So this young African-American male that has this disability, he's deaf, he becomes a quadriplegic. It's mind-boggling to me that a human being can be so insensitive and so callous about someone else's needs, especially a young man that needs the money to survive. And it's so is that psychopathic? I mean, I don't think you need a psychologist to say that there's definitely some psychopathic features in that.
If that's not bad enough, just taking Hakeem's millions of dollars that he actually needed to survive, if you want to talk about lack of remorse, he then used Hakeem in his law firm commercials and went to his hospital room and filmed him in his wheelchair and in his hospital bed, saying that they got him a settlement and look at this. And then they literally stole everything from him, or Alex stole everything from him. So if you want a lack of remorse, just the fact that they would continue and then he would use him in his advertisements.
Yeah, he also bought $115,000 Mercedes for Maggie with that money too. So, I mean, it's right. It's astonishing the level of callousness, and callousness is a major feature of psychopathy. It's probably, as for children, if you notice that children are callous and kind of indifferent and lack empathy, that's a potential predictor of later psychopaths. And I don't know if Alec had that as a child. I think it's possible to speculate that Paul may have, but as an adult, Alex certainly has those qualities.
For sure.
especially growing up in that family with that family lineage. I don't feel like, well, I don't know, but they probably weren't just like concerned parents like, oh, my child might have these, attributes and stuff. So all of that is extremely interesting. And honestly, I feel like me and Rex could probably talk to you all for like another 20 minutes because this is so interesting. I feel like I'm learning so much. But we do have to close out. Is there anything else that you want our viewers to know?
I think I would actually hand the last question over to you guys. Is there anything that you feel like might wrap this up for you?
Yeah, maybe what are some, now that he's been convicted and everything, what are some of the biggest unanswered questions that people are still dying to find out?
Well, there's definitely Stephen Smith. Stephen Smith's a big question mark, right? And a couple of the documentaries speculated that Buster might have some involvement in that particular crime. So I think it's really incredible to speculate that if Buster, and again, this is pure speculation, this is based on the documentaries, but that if Buster had some involvement in a murder, it's feasible to say that every member of the Murdaugh, that particular family, may have had some involvement in a murder, which I have never, in my 25 years as a forensic psychologist, I've never seen anything like that. And when I say that, I also mean that there's some speculation that Maggie may have had something to do with Gloria Satterfield's death.
Right.
So that would mean that Paul, Alec, Maggie, and Buster, and again, this is speculation, but each one of them may have had some involvement in a murder. And that's mind-boggling to think that.
That's 3 out of 4, right? So that's still really crazy.
Yeah.
I also think it's going to be interesting just to watch how they handle the investigation of Stephen Smith. It's an open investigation. Are they going to pull any Murdaugh, in for an interview now? Will that happen? I think it's going to teach us just how much power remains in this family. And I think that's something people are really curious about. Did their dynasty unravel, or will they continue having power and people and law enforcement being fearful of them? I think it's going to be really interesting just to watch the investigation of Stephen Smith and where it leads.